Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Is the United States hell-bent on self-destruction? A pandemic, a dramatic economic turndown, and now massive civil unrest all point to decline. Could this have been avoided? Also, targeting Hong Kong, watching the neoliberal forced regime playbook in real time. To discuss this and more, I'm joined by my guest, Marcus Papadopoulos in London. He's the editor of Politics First magazine. And in Budapest, we have George Samueli. He is author of Bombs for Peace, NATO's Humanitarian War on Yugoslavia. All right, gentlemen, Crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Okay, let's go to George first here. Let's talk about what's going on in the United States, because there's a lot of elements to address here. First of all, the mainstream media wanted to say it's racism, racism, racism. And of course, there is racism in the United States. And what happened to the George Floyd in Minneapolis is unforgivable, though there's still information we need to learn about that. Jumping to conclusions too quickly as has been shown to be a very bad idea. And we have to get to the point of this civil unrest. I mean, what I see, this is rioting. This is not protesting here. And at the end of the day, George, the biggest victims of this rioting are poor people and people of color at the end of the day. Go ahead, George.
You're absolutely right, Peter. There really is very little excuse for this rioting. I mean, if we go back to the events of last week, the 4 police officers were fired immediately. It was just, as soon as it was over, they were fired immediately. Every single commentator in the United States condemned this. I mean, even the most right-wing commentators, the pro-police crowd, the Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, Judge Jeanine Pirro, they all condemned it. So there was no attempt to say, oh, well, hey, this was this is understandable reaction on the part of a policeman. Now, if you contrast that with what happened 3 years ago, same city, Minneapolis, when a young Australian woman, white Australian woman, who was shot dead by a black police officer. The black police officer was apparently threatened by a woman in her nightgown, and he shot her dead. There were no protests, there were no riots, there were no condemnations. Hardly anyone even knew about this event. The police officer was placed on suspension, on full pay. It wasn't fired immediately. And after some time, a couple of years went by, he was indeed prosecuted and sent to prison for 12 years. Now, if America really had a problem with systemic white racism, then it would be exact reverse. What you would have is widespread hysteria about a black officer shooting dead a white woman, and as opposed to this case, where people would be saying, well, these are white officers. Of course, they felt threatened by a black man. It didn't happen.
It's a narrative they use for their own political ends here. Marcus, I mean, I can understand people protesting and being angry about the needless death of any citizen, irrespective of color here. But how does that justify in any way, shape, or form looting and burning down buildings? How does that justify the mainstream media not talking about elements of Antifa infiltrating all cities that are experiencing a social unrest now? There's very few people that want to talk about that because, how do you justify looting, particularly when you're looting stores? The biggest victims are the poor and the people that are the weakest in society. Go ahead, Marcus.
What the world, Peter, has been witness to over the last week or so is the true face of America, not the Hollywood depiction of America and American society, but the reality of American society. Because on the one hand, the world observes consecutive American governments, be it Democratic or Republican, moving across the world, plundering countries, looting countries, destroying the economies of countries. And then on the other hand, we have so-called protesters in American towns and cities looting shops, destroying businesses, destroying people's livelihoods, destroying people's lives. That is the true reality of American society. not the reality of Hollywood, not the reality of American mainstream media and British mainstream media that depicts America as almost a heaven on earth. And then we have to take into consideration the organization Antifa. Antifa proclaims itself to be a political movement. Well, Peter, it is not a political movement, and it is even less so a socialist or communist movement. Antifa is simply a violent, mindless, degenerate and depraved movement, which in my opinion should be classified now as a terrorist organization. And you know, I have no sympathy with American foreign policy, but I do have sympathy with the lives of ordinary Americans, because I have observed Antifa activists destroying shops, looting shops, taking people's livelihoods away from them, and in particular, the community in America that appears to be suffering the most from these atrocious actions of Antifa is the very community that Antifa professes to supporting and defending, the African American community. That is the community that is suffering the most.
You know, George, it's very much an era of despair and disgust, because we see during this pandemic crisis, you know, and we can go all the way back to 2008. I mean, these massive transfers of wealth to the wealthy, to people already wealthy. You know, these bailouts or stimulus, whatever you want to call them. Essentially, the rich and powerful had concierge service. And working people, it's an afterthought, okay? And, oh, the horror of it, somebody might be getting unemployment where they're making more money than when they're working. Well, that says a lot about the state of the economy, doesn't it? Okay? I mean, kind of going off a little bit with what Marcus had to say, this is really kind of a culture of looting, okay? You have the elites loot the world. They have the elites that have looted the middle class, the working class. And now when you ask people, and watching mainstream media, I mean, very, very mainstream, asking these protesters, quote unquote, what they're protesting. Well, George Floyd that's last week's news, okay? I mean, it's riot for riot's sake. And that really is kind of the Antifa playbook, because Antifa is anti-political, because to be political is to engage, and they do not want to do that. They want chaos that they most likely don't face any consequences of. I mean, most of them are white, after all, privileged white people, I would say, in my opinion here. So we're in a very anti-political environment. Go ahead, George.
Yes, absolutely right. And when you see these rioters, many of them are white. I mean, these are, this isn't black rage over what happened to a black man. These are white people, and essentially it is help yourself time. I mean, we've seen those scenes of people breaking into Louis Vuitton in Portland, Oregon, and help yourself to some, designer handbags. So this is indeed looting. And what you can see, going back to your point about the looting that has taken place for many years, looting from the middle class, with this grotesque transfer of wealth to not even to the 1%, but to the 0.1%. So we have the same victims of the looting. I mean, we have shopkeepers. And again, with this footage of a shopkeeper trying to defend himself, and it was just basically kicked to death. So these are the people who are barely able to exist. They go from paycheck to paycheck, who are looted by that 0.1% and by the Antifa crowd. And not only that, these people who are the victims are the ones who are regularly condemned in the media as being racist or Trump supporters or sexist or, the deplorables a la Hillary Clinton. So it's a double whammy of being
the double whammy is perfectly said, because Marcus, you have like Antifa, and then you have the mainstream media, and then the ruling elites. They love it's racism. You know why? Because the ruling classes, the moneyed classes, and people like Antifa, they don't want you to talk about what's most important, and that's class. because class involves every single skin color, and they never will address that. They always do this shell game of, oh, it's just systemic racism. This is the deflection, and I think this also adds to the general anger and frustration that people have, because the political realm has been shut down. Because if you disagree with what the mainstream says, then you're somehow beyond. You're out. You cannot be part of the church, as it were. Here, this what's going on right now is an intentional destruction of politics and a deflection away from politics. Go ahead, Marcus.
To engage in politics requires intellectualism and cognition, and neither Antifa nor American mainstream media have neither of those. And I believe, Peter, that what we are seeing in America is also what we are seeing in other countries which comprise the West, in particular Britain, because Britain and America today, the two countries which form the nucleus of the West, have deteriorated over the last 20 to 30 years. What I believe, Peter, is that America and Britain are intellectually, cognitively, culturally, and morally dead. And I put that down to the effects of corporate capitalism and also to the loss of religion, because religion is absolutely the absolute fundamental pillar of a society, or unless a society is, for example, communist. If in a society you have to have a fundamental pillar which keeps the people together, which creates harmony. But in America and Britain, that fundamental pillar, Christianity, has all but disappeared. And that is why culturally both countries are dead. And if a country loses its culture, it loses its national identity. And then people will take actions which they believe suit themselves, and they will have no regard for anyone else in society. And we have the effects of celebrity culture and reality television. It's poison people's minds.
The thing is it's a civic religion has been proven to be an abject failure. Look at the streets of America right now. Civic religion is a failure. Okay, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on some real news. Stay with our team. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing some real news. Okay, let's change gears here. Marcus, let me go back to you. Let's talk about what's going on in Hong Kong. Considering what's going on in the streets of America right now and what the United States is meddling, and that's exactly what it is, meddling in Hong Kong. So let me see if I get the logic correct here. So the way the United States is treating Hong Kong, which last time I heard was part of China. So I suppose President Xi of China should be commenting and sanctioning the United States, how it treats its citizens in cities all across America. Huge civil rights and human rights violations. But we all know that's not going to happen. What's going on in Hong Kong? And please make clear to our people, our viewers here, that the United States approach to China is completely beyond and outside of international law. Go ahead, Marcus.
Well, heaven forbid, Peter, you're implicitly accusing the American government of double standards. I would, deplore such an argument. But in all seriousness, Peter, the situation in Hong Kong has reached a new and critical stage, because after 1 year of violent protests, of social disorder in Hong Kong, which has manifested itself in the stabbings of police officers, Beijing is now taking very decisive action. The Chinese legislator has now passed a national security law which will enable the Chinese authorities to directly confront extremism in Hong Kong and also secessionism in Hong Kong. And the protests, and I use the word protest in a very loose way, because what we have seen for nearly a year in Hong Kong has clearly been orchestrated by British and American special services. Now, in response to China passing a national security law, the British government has threatened to offer residents citizenship to 300,000 citizens of Hong Kong who have British national overseas passports. Now, that potentially could be a turning point in this situation, because the British decision, or what Britain is saying it will do unless China backtracks on its national security law, which of course the Chinese will.
And its sovereignty. And its sovereignty.
What the British are saying is a flagrant, serious violation of Chinese sovereignty. So what we can say, Peter, is that the Chinese are certainly not going to compromise an inch over Chinese sovereignty. But at the same time, Peter, the British and the Americans are in this for the long haul.
Yeah, George, one of the things that I find so bewildering, the focus on Hong Kong, and you have the former High Commissioner of Britain commenting on the condition of democracy and civil society in Hong Kong. Now, let me see if I remember this. It was a colony of the British, and there was no democracy there ever. It was a colony. You don't have democracy, okay? So what gives the United States the right, and particularly the UK, to talk about civil society and democracy in Hong Kong? I mean, that would be as if the Chinese Communist Party would be commenting on local elections in London. I mean, they wouldn't do it because it would be wrong, it would be meddling. But of course, it is this exceptional way of looking at the world and stoking up tensions where they're not necessary whatsoever. Marcus brought up a very important point, a sedition and independence. I mean, do that in any Western country and you're going to find yourself in a lot of trouble, particularly if you're taking foreign money. And go to the National Endowment for Democracy, their website, and they're completely transparent what they're doing. Okay, I mean, this is, you know what this is akin to? Not Tiananmen Square, it's akin to Ukraine in 2014. Go ahead.
Yes, no, that's exactly right. It is hilarious now with all these commentators coming on television and saying, well, China has broken its pledges on Hong Kong. China hasn't broken anything. The Sino-British joint declaration, and China said, this is what we will maintain. But Britain has no sovereign rights over Hong Kong. Britain gave them up in 1997. It is entirely up to China how Hong Kong is governed. So China hasn't broken any pledges at all. And China, because this is sovereign Chinese territory, China is entitled to take whatever measures are necessary to bring to an end sedition, terrorism, secessionism, with the same determination that any European power or the United States would do if it happened in their territories. We saw what happened in Spain and what they did in Catalonia. I mean, they just simply arrested the leaders and put them in prison. No one said boo about that. I mean, so China is entitled to do exactly the same thing. And the remarkable thing is that China has actually been extremely tolerant over Hong Kong. It has maintained the autonomy. It has done all of that, but there is a limit to what it can put up with. And clearly, I mean, it's not going to put up with endless violence. I mean, I was surprised that they put up with it as long as they did. So it's understandable that they're now, essentially saying enough is enough, and we're going to impose order on Hong Kong.
Marcus, this imperial habits are so annoying, and particularly and probably very frustrating when you're on the receiving end of it here. I mean, this is an internal affair of China, and this lack of respect of that is very troubling. And as I said, the National Endowment of Democracy, they're patently clear on what they're trying to do. They're trying to create internal divisions, chaos. And if you, over the last year, I mean, as everyone in the West naively, stupidly, and uninformedly cheerlead these people, actually, a lot of the violence you see going on in the streets of America right now were happening in Hong Kong as well. And I'd like to point out to all the good liberals that have have crocodile tears for Hong Kong is that, a lot of the quote unquote protests and violence were actually against ethnic Han Chinese. I mean, there's even a racist element to this here, which is completely overlooked by the mainstream media. Go ahead, Marcus.
The Chinese have been exceedingly tolerant over the social disorder in Hong Kong for nearly a year now. And one of the reasons is because China cares about its reputation on the international stage. China does not want to take any action which could undermine the 1985 agreement signed between Deng Xiaoping and Margaret Thatcher, which said that Hong Kong would be returned to China in 1997. China does not want to be seen as America. China wants to be seen as a country which, when it signs an agreement, it adheres to that agreement, unlike what the Americans have done, for example, when it comes to the Iran nuclear deal. But it's very, very evident that British imperialism and American imperialism is alive and well. I submit to you, Peter, that both London and Washington regard Hong Kong and also Xinjiang as constituting the Achilles heel of China, or more specifically, the Achilles heel of the Chinese economy. And perhaps the British and the Americans don't really seriously believe that they can tear away Hong Kong from China. But what I do believe, they believe, is that by causing so much civil unrest, so much violence in Hong Kong, that could eventually have a very, very critical impact on the Chinese economy and could also encourage other regions of Hong Kong which are somewhat restless, in particular Xinjiang. So what I am arguing, Peter, is that perhaps Washington and London are hoping that by causing so much social disorder in Hong Kong, that this could instigate a domino effect in China. And I believe that the Islamist secessionists comprised of both ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Xinjiang are, rubbing their hands with glee at what is happening at the moment in Hong Kong. And let us also not forget, and I believe, Peter, I said this on an episode of Crosstalk not so long ago, that the Americans and Turkey and Saudi Arabia have already started facilitating the arrival of ISIS fighters in Xinjiang. And I can say that based on Chinese diplomats who have told me that, and it is quite well known in China, Peter.
George, the interesting thing is that all of this attention on Hong Kong, at the end of the day, it gets negative returns because Hong Kong, its importance to the Chinese economy has been diminishing year after year. That China has plenty of financial hubs right now. I mean, Hong Kong isn't the prize or the pearl that it used to be, but by this a colored revolution attempt that they're applying in Hong Kong with plenty of willing participants, okay? Again, go to the National Endowment of Democracy site. They have their pictures and shaking hands with Pompeo and members of Congress. This is all transparent here. But the thing is that whatever made it different, one country, two systems, it's actually these activists in league with their foreign friends that are actually destroying the value of Hong Kong even more, just at a quicker pace. Go ahead, George.
Yes, that's right. And I agree with what Marcus was saying, which is that the Chinese are concerned with the domino effect that this rioting and sedition that's taking place in Hong Kong, the domino effect it will have in the rest of China, because that's really what the Chinese are most concerned with, the disintegration of their country. I mean, this is something that's ingrained in the Chinese mind. They remember the 19th century and what happened and how easily China was picked off by foreign colonial powers. They do not want to go back to that. And so any thought that what's happening in Hong Kong could spread to the rest of China, and particularly to Xinjiang, that's what causes them to be extremely concerned. So it's not even the question of Hong Kong's importance to the Chinese economy. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Hong Kong isn't that important. I mean, it was back in the 80s, 90s. It certainly isn't the case today. But the thought that the United States is attempting to destroy China, to attempt to break China up, that is something that's very real. There's no question that that is the United States goal. I mean, it's the same goal as the United States is doing in Iran and elsewhere. What the United States did in the Russian Federation after the collapse of communism, not even during communism, after the collapse of communism, which is to stir up all sorts of nationalist, irredentist movements, and of course, religious extremism.
And when it all doesn't work, they leave, and they leave the place in chaos for others to clean up. That's all the time we have, gentlemen. I want to thank my guests in London and in Budapest, and I want to thank our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. Remember, crosstalk rules.